The almost 3-year rule of Mohammad Ali Shah coincided with a period of profound change. The push for constitutionalism and the opening of parliament were just a few signs of the Iranian people's thirst for progress. However, the person leading the country during this era was the antithesis of their aspirations. As a conservative king who yearned for a return to the golden age of his grandfather, Mohammad Ali Shah did everything in his power to hinder the progress made by the Iranian people. But on July 13, 1909, as the constitutionalist forces were close to conquering the capital, he had no choice but to give up his pursuit of conservatism and escape to the only place where he would be safe. After Tehran was captured, the constitutionalists wanted a fresh start. They didn't want to seem vindicative or looking for settling personal grudges. Therefore, the committee in charge of restoring peace to Tehran made the deal with the ex-Shah to safely leave the country and allowed him to take shelter in Russia. The directorate in charge of negotiating Mohammad Ali Shah's exile even granted a hefty monthly salary of 100 rials equal to $100 for him to prevent angering the hardcore monarchists of the previous era. Following his abdication and the ascension of the new king, the constitutionalists were eager to relegate Mohammad Ali Shah's reign to the history books and focus on rebuilding the country. However, the exiled Shah had different intentions. In July 1911, news came to Tehran that the deposed Shah had returned to Iran with an army and had entered the country through a northeastern port on the Caspian Sea. The exiled Shah had arrived on a Russian ship with a few thousand troops consisting of Turkmen tribesmen from their region. As the constitutionalists scrambled to muster a force to confront the rebellion, they learned that Mohammad Ali Shah was not alone. His younger brother, along with an army of Kurdish fighters, had joined him to restore his rule to the land. Salar-ed-Dowleh was Mozaffar's third son and Muhammad Ali's younger brother. After the deposition of his brother, he had met with him outside of the country where they planned their coup to take back the country and restore the original monarchy. Their objective was straightforward. Muhammad Ali would lead an offensive from the Caspian Sea in the north, and Salar-ed-Dowleh would strike from the northwest. After capturing their ancestral city of Tabriz, the two armies would join forces and they would march to Tehran to regain power. While the skirmish was underway, the government had grave concerns about their chances. Tehran was still filled with people from the previous era and loyal to the deposed king. The old guard Qajar loyalists were still integrated into the court, and they might not have been able to prevent Muhammad Ali's return to the throne. As the coup continued, constitutionalists once again called on Bakhtiari riders to come to their help. The government also put a warrant for Mohammad Ali Shah, dead or alive, and set a prize of $237,000 for his capture. With Bakhtiari riders getting closer to Tabriz and dead set on bringing the Shah's corpse to the capital, Muhammad Ali, spooked and scared for his life, got on his ship and fled back to Russia, never to see his country again. Hi, my name is Oriana, and you're listening to The Lion and the Sun, a modern history of Iran. The relationship between Russia and Persia dates back centuries and has been marked by periods of both cooperation and conflict. The earliest recorded contact between the two cultures was in the 16th century when Tsar Ivan IV, also known as Ivan the Terrible, sent an embassy to Persia. At the time, both Russia and Persia were expanding their empires and saw opportunities for trade and diplomacy. During the Safavid Empire and until the mid-18th century, Russia and Persia's relationship was peaceful and to some extent cooperative as both powers sought to counter the growing threat of the Ottoman Empire. However, tensions arose as Russia expanded southward into the Caspian Sea region, encroaching on Persian territory and disrupting trade routes. These tensions led to several Russo-Persian wars in the 18th and 19th centuries. The Russo-Persian Wars, spanning from 1651 to 1828, were a series of conflicts rooted in territorial disputes between the Russian Empire and Persia, particularly over regions in the Caucasus, such as Iran, Georgia, Armenia, and much of Dagestan, collectively referred to as Transcaucasia. These wars were emblematic of the larger geopolitical contest of the era, exasperated by the interests and interventions of the Ottoman Empire, which also sought influence over these strategically situated territories. In the early days of the Qajar dynasty, Fath Ali Shah aimed to reclaim the northernmost areas of his realm, particularly modern-day Georgia, that had been annexed by Tsar Paul I of Russia following the Russo-Persian War of 1796. The military engagements during these wars underscored the asymmetry in military capabilities between the adversaries. Despite often being numerically outnumbered by the Persians, Russian forces were able to leverage superior tactics, weapons, and sometimes external geopolitical circumstances to their advantage to defeat the Qajar forces time and time again. The outcomes of these wars significantly altered the regional geopolitical landscape. Treaties concluding the wars, such as the Treaty of Golestan in 1813 and the Treaty of Turkmenkai of 1828, resulted in Persia ceding substantial territories to Russia, including regions of modern-day Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Dagestan. In the late 19th century, Persia was becoming increasingly reliant on foreign loans and struggled to modernize its military and infrastructure. In 1878, during his second journey to Europe, Nasir al-Din Shah of Iran was greatly impressed by the Russian Cossacks' discipline and military prowess he encountered across Transcaucasia. This experience inspired the formation of the Persian Cossack Brigade in 1879, modeled after Russian Cossack formations. The Shah, with the aid of Russian military advisors, established this unit aiming to foster a disciplined, reliable fighting force within Iran. What started as a regiment under the command of Russian officers quickly expanded into a brigade due to the Shah's keen interest and the evident progress in its training and organization. The Persian Cossack Brigade marked a significant step towards military modernization in Iran. Its formation not only reflected the Shah's desire for a modernized force, but also the growing Russian influence in Iran during this period. Russia and other European powers saw Persia as a potential sphere of influence and competed for economic and political control in the region. In 1907, Russia and Britain reached an agreement to divide Persia into two spheres of influence, with Russia controlling the north and Britain controlling the south. During the reign of Mohammad Ali Shah, Russia gained immense powers and influence over the Persian kingdom. The Russian Cossack Brigade was acting as Shah's private army, and most of his close advisors had ties to the Northern Empire. When Muhammad Ali attempted to retake the empire from his son, it was clear that he had support from St. Petersburg. Russia has always been against the constitution and rule of the people, and this was their attempt to once again tighten their grip on their southern neighbors. As Muhammad Ali Mirza marched his army towards Tehran, the lack of any condemnation or objection from the Russian authorities was conspicuous. Despite the constitutionalist efforts to appease the Russian Empire and the presence of their Cossack Brigade, the Russians still perceived the new order as a danger to their interests and were hoping that by staying clear of Muhammad Ali Mirza's coup attempt, they'd once again find their footing in Persia. Regrettably, this deliberate silence only served to further tarnish the already strained relations between the two neighbors. This non-response from Russia only served to set the stage for an inevitable and potentially dangerous future confrontation. After the nationalists marched to Tehran and the reopening of the parliament, a mandate was set to sort out the finances of the country. With the overspending habits of the previous king, Persia's debt to other countries, and the corruption rampant in every office, Iran had a huge revenue problem. To make sure that the country's finances were well managed, the court reached out to the U.S. State Department to receive a recommendation for a financial advisor. To the eyes of the Persian government, the United States seemed a safe choice for reaching out to get recommendations from. Unlike the European powers and Persia's northern neighbor, the United States had limited presence in the country. The first official contact between the United States and Persia occurred in 1856 when the Persian government appointed a consul in Washington, D.C. In 1883, the U.S. reciprocated by sending Samuel Benjamin as a consul to Persia. Throughout the 19th century, American missionaries established schools and medical facilities in Iran, which helped to create a positive image of the United States among the Iranian people. This period also saw increased trade between the two countries, albeit limited in scope, mainly because the U.S. wanted to stay away from the Anglo-Russian zones of influence. In 1911, at the behest of the Iranian legation in Washington, the U.S. State Department recommended William Morgan Schuster to serve as a Treasurer General for the government of Persia. William Morgan Schuster was an American lawyer, civil servant, and financial expert who was well known in the U.S. government for his integrity and candor. Schuster was invited by the Iranian government to help reorganize and modernize the country's financial system. Schuster's tenure as Treasurer General was marked by his efforts to bring transparency and accountability to Iran's finances. He established a new system of tax collection, worked to reduce corruption, and fought against foreign intervention in Iran's financial affairs. However, his reforms and strong stance against foreign influence angered both Britain and Russia. After Mohammad Ali Mirza's failed attempt to recapture the country, the parliament gave authorization to Schuster to confiscate the properties of the treasoners, including Salar-ed-Dowleh, Muhammad Ali's brother, who was a co-conspirator in the coup ploy. Schuster planned on seizing the prince's residence, but the Russians intervened by instructing the Cossack officers to occupy the palace and deny entry to Schuster's team. The Russian government's argument was based on the fact that the prince had secured a loan from the Russian mortgage bank, and as a result, the palace served as collateral that belonged to Russia. Additionally, they asserted that Salar-ed-Dowleh was a Russian protege, meaning he was under their protection, and therefore the government had no right to seize his property. Despite Russia's apparent involvement in the recent coup attempt and its meddling in the internal affairs of the country, the Persian government still yielded to their pressure. In an attempt to defuse the tensions, the Minister of Foreign Affairs ordered Schuster to stand down and extended a personal apology to the Russian team on behalf of the government. Seeing Iran's fear of a showdown, Russia decided to push harder with what it wanted. They figured that Iran wasn't in a good place to have a foe on its northern border, so any extra pressure might make Iran give in to what Russia was asking for. In November 1911, the Russian government gave another ultimatum to Persia. They said that due to his transgressions, the government must dismiss Morgan Schuster from his post as a Treasurer General and sent his entire team back to the U.S. They also made an insertion that Persia was not to engage the help and service of other countries without the consent of the Russians and the British. Finally, they demanded that the Persian government should pay for the cost of Russian troops deployed in the region, meaning that Iran had to pay and feed the foreign invaders settling inside its borders. The sheer audacity of the Russians angered the Persian community. Nationwide protests of outrage took place in various Iranian cities, with the clergies making speeches in mosques in support of Schuster. This was the first instance that the religious community was putting its support and influence behind a foreign individual, and showed the level of respect the community held for Schuster and his reforms. This nationwide outcry was led by Mohammad Kazem Khorasani. Khorasani was a prominent Shia jurist and philosopher active in the country's politics since the late 19th century. Born in Tus, Iran, he studied in Najaf, Iraq, where he became an influential religious scholar and later a marja, a top-ranking Shia religious authority. During the reign of Mohammad Ali Shah, when Sheikh Fazlallah Nuri issued the fatwa for the death of the protesters for their resistance toward the monarchy, Khorasani retaliated by announcing that Sheikh Fazlallah was himself no longer a Muslim, leading to Fazlallah's execution. Khorasani, a student of Mirza Shirazi, the influential cleric responsible for the tobacco fatwa, understood the vital role religious figures could play in political struggles. Following the Russian ultimatum, he assumed a leadership position in the battle against the meddling of Persia's northern neighbors. With a resolute mandate and the support of the public, the parliament defied the orders of the Russian regime by rejecting their ultimatum at the 11th hour. Yet despite the people's and parliament's stance against the ultimatum, another obstacle brought their momentum to a halt. After the initial wave of protests, Khorasani was getting ready to move back to Tehran and issue a religious order, similar to Shirazi's fatwa against tobacco. He wanted to hold the Russians accountable and declared jihad against their forces. But before embarking on this journey, on December 13, 1911, Khorasani died under mysterious circumstances. While there was no concrete evidence pointing to the Russians, many speculated that it was the two superpowers that had planned the inconspicuous murder of the prominent clergy. Ultimately, and regardless of the intentions, Khorasani's death resulted in the demoralization of the public and gave Russians the perfect opportunity to strong-arm Persia into submission. After Parliament's stance against the empire, Russia ordered its forces to enter the country through the northwestern borders and recapture the city of Tabriz. Despite the fight put on by the remnants of Sattar Khan's army, the Russian forces were ultimately successful in taking the city. Their army, comprised of more than 5,000 soldiers, unleashed a brutal campaign of destruction and savagery, leaving in their wake a trail of rape, plunder, and death. The city was engulfed by an ominous cloud of fear and horror, casting a somber spell over the community. The corpses of those executed by the merciless invaders dangled lifelessly from the gallows for days as a chilling reminder of the city's tragic fate. The streets, once bustling with life, were now silent and empty, the echoes of terror reverberating through the emptiness. Gradually, city by city, the Russian army managed to occupy their entire agreed-upon sphere of influence in northern Persia. To keep up with the ambitions of their regional partners, the British also expanded their presence in the south and managed to move up parts of the Indian army through the Persian Gulf and station them within Persia. As the unofficial occupation of Persia by the two superpowers went on, the crisis in Tehran reached unprecedented heights. The parliament was still adamant in standing against Russia's ultimatum, but the executive branch found itself facing a difficult situation with the growing Russian military presence in the north and Britain's in the south. Ultimately, the government felt cornered and yielded to the mounting pressure exerted by Russia. In a consequential move, the government declared its intention to remove Schuster from his official role. In reaction, the Majlis, Persia's parliament, unanimously passed a vote of no confidence against the Grand Vizier Najaf Qoli Khan Bakhtiari. Bakhtiari was a pro-British leader who had assumed power after the short-lived rule of Sepahadar, a military commander pivotal in the liberation of Tehran. Najaf Qoli Khan was a proponent of adhering to the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907, an agreement that had effectively partitioned Persia into northern and southern zones, each under the sway of a different foreign power. His stance met with severe disapproval from the Majlis, prompting him to tender his resignation. Nevertheless, even the departure of the Shah's Grand Vizier wasn't sufficient to quell the relentless Russian pressure. As mentioned in the previous episode, due to Ahmad Shah's young age at the time of ascension to the throne, a council of constitutional activists appointed Azad al-Mulk as his acting regent. Azad al-Mulk, a patriarch of the Qajar dynasty, was commonly referred to as the Honorable Uncle. Upon his death on September 23, 1910, the parliament selected Nasir al-Mulk as the second regent for the youthful king. Educated at Oxford and hailing from a wealthy, influential family, Nasir al-Mulk possessed a nuanced understanding of Persia's geopolitical landscape. However, despite his qualifications, he was inherently cautious and refrained from taking assertive actions that could potentially provoke foreign powers. Confronted with the reality of thousands of Russian troops residing in the country's northern regions, the risk of a full-scale invasion weighed heavily on Nasir al-Mulk. Feeling cornered, he opted to align with Najaf Qoli Khan's earlier decision to consent to Russian demands. Consequently, he granted the newly appointed prime minister the authority to undertake all necessary measures to safeguard the capital and avert a full-blown conflict with Russia. On December 24th, the Grand Vizier ordered his forces to march on the Majlis and occupy the building. The armed forces forcibly expelled all the representatives and threatened them with death if they attempted to convene parliamentary sessions anywhere else. After the occupation, the regent declared the parliament closed once again and suspended the constitutional procedures due to extraordinary circumstances. The halls of the legislative body, the site of years of bitter infighting and political turmoil, now stood empty, a silent witness to the shifting tides of history. With the sudden dissolution of the parliament, the country once again fell under the shadow of full monarchy, a return to a time of unchecked power and the whims of the few. The people of Persia, who had long struggled for their voice to be heard, now found themselves adrift in a sea of uncertainty, wondering what the future held in store for their beloved land. Finally, in January 1912, less than a year after their arrival, Morgan Schuster and his American team were forced to resign and leave the country that they had hoped to improve. On the eve of their departure, a restless energy filled the air as people poured into Baristan Square in front of the now sealed-off parliament to voice their frustration and anger. The cries of "Independence or death" echoed through the city blocks, a rallying chant for a people tired of the unending interference of foreign powers in their affairs. Upon his return to the United States, Morgan Schuster published a personal recollection of his time in Persia, in which he provided a vivid portrayal of the aggression of European powers in the politics of the region. In his book, he expressed deep disappointment at being forcibly deprived of the opportunity to finish his intensely interesting task in that ancient land due to the recklessness of two powerful countries that played fast and loose with laws and lives of the Iranian people, leading to what he saw as the hopelessness of Persia's self-reorganization. Schuster dedicated his book to the Persian people and described the destruction of the democratic experience as a sordid ending to a gallant struggle for liberty and enlightenment. Following the departure of Schuster and the failure of the Second Majlis, Persia found itself right back where it started, a nation under the shadow of its powerful northern and southern neighbors, with a populace whose voices were silenced and a monarchy that disregarded all the progress made over the previous decade. The promising strides toward democracy and self-determination had been cut short, reverting the country to the previous century. But as Persia was at its lowest point, the world powers were gearing up for a gruesome war that would consume the next 4 years and lead to societal change in every nation and change the sphere of power within the region. In the next episode of The Lion and the Sun, we would see the impact of World War I on Iran and the beginnings of the collapse of a once mighty Qajar empire. Thank you for joining me on this episode of The Lion and the Sun. To learn more about the events and people mentioned in this episode, please visit our website at thelionandthesun.org. If you also want to see supporting photos, timelines, and character guides, you can follow us on Instagram and TikTok, and for early access to episodes and other perks, you can join our Patreon. The links are in the description. If you like this episode and our show so far, don't forget to rate the podcast and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to us from. Your feedback will help us improve and bring you even more engaging content in the future. We look forward to continuing this journey with you and exploring the rich history of Iran together. My name is Oriana, and I will see you in 2 weeks. Thanks for listening.